so that we don't, I don't screw that up. That's kind of my goal, not to screw anything up today. So Kyle, just as a heads up, I don't know if you've kind of done this at webinars or not before, but basically when you're not speaking, turn off your camera and turn yourself on mute, turn off your sound. And what that will do is just make sure that the participants that are watching only see a couple of boxes, and it won't confuse the ASL users. So that's kind of the main thing with the webinar. And then do you guys, I'm guessing you want questions at the end? I'll kind of
I'll kind of try and watch them. We
yeah,
might
we can
do
kind
a
of
few as
monitor
we,
the Q&A.
yeah, as we go along, just because
Yep.
sometimes it fits the conversation better to do it that way.
Okay, yeah, and if
So
if
I'll
I
watch
do
it.
see that, yeah, if you don't see something, Paula, and I kind of see something, I'll ask it as we go along, sort of thing. But then we'll also do a specific sort of Q&A at the end if people have big old questions.
Yeah.
So do you guys have any questions? We got about 5 minutes before we get started. Had about 240 registrants.
So no, Paula, I take it you'll just kind of direct me when you need me to provide input?
Sure.
Okay.
As long as you promise that you'll speak up when I point on you.
You betcha I will.
All right.
Love it. I love it.
No, I enjoyed our conversation. I really did.
Yeah, we kind of, when we did a dry run, we ended up discussing it further ourselves. So it was kind of fun.
Perfect. So my fun story of the day is I just got over COVID last week and I got stung by a bee on my first walk today. I'm like, really? Really? I'm starting to reintegrate into society now. And like, I get stung by a bee. And it was on the wrong finger too. It was on my pointer finger. What's the use in that? Oh man. Cool.
My brother is here and he's the foremost expert on raising bees in the country.
Oh wow.
Oh,
Published
wow.
five books on the subject.
Of course your brother is, Paula. I wouldn't expect anything less from you.
So if you have questions about that sting as it proceeds, just let me know. You do know to gently brush off the stinger, right?
There was no stinger.
Well, that's good.
I think it was a wasp.
It might have been not a bee.
It then proceeded to fly around my head and I swatted it and ran. So.
Yeah, not a bee, but okay.
Yeah, not a bee. But that's okay. So fun times. I will be sharing the slideshow. I have it ready to go already. So should be good with that.
I'm going to turn on the fan here.
I'm going to see Paula's hair blowing in the breeze.
Yes, my time to cut hair.
It's going to be so pretty, Paula.
Thank you. You're so sweet.
I'm so glad I got this all on recording. Got about 2 minutes. So just giving you the countdown, you know.
Should we take our faces off?
You can leave them on for now. I'm very relaxed with these. So you could leave them on until it says 3 o'clock and I'll be like, okay guys, faces off, sound off.
Okay.
So yeah. I have like my full kind of script ready to go. So and just to confirm, it's Kyle Kleist and Annetta Johnson, correct?
Yes.
Yep, you got it.
Great. Great. And then Kayla, it looks like you are starting off with ASL, I believe. Awesome. Cool. We'll go in like 1 minute. I'll hit start webinar. Oh my God, no, do not start yawning right now. Okay, you guys ready? Let's go. Hello, everyone. As you start to come in, we're going to give it about 30 seconds, wait for the attendee field to populate, and wait for everyone to get in, and then we'll get started. Give it another couple seconds here. It looks like people are still joining. Okay, so hello, everyone. My name is Jenny Sitchell with the National Council on Independent Living, and I help coordinate logistics for these events. I'm also the operations director at NCIL. I want to welcome you all to our latest ILNet teleconference and webinar, CIL's use of self and peer monitoring as a management tool. My pronouns are she, her, and to give you a visual description, I'm a white female with brown hair pulled back. I have on a navy blue shirt. Yeah, that's my awesome description. And today's presentation is brought to you by the ILNet Training and Technical Assistance Project for CILs and SILCs. The ILNet is operated by ILRU in collaboration with NCIL, April, and the University of Montana, with support provided by the Administration for Community Living at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So before we get fully into this webinar today, I want to go through a couple housekeeping tips and accessibility items. We do have CART captioning and ASL interpreters that are available today. You can access the captioning through the Show Subtitle tab in your menu bar. If you don't see that, you can look under More Options, and it should be on the right-hand side under More or the 3 ellipses. Our ASL interpreter should be appearing in the video screen next to me. Make sure that you are in gallery mode in order to see them. And as we will be screen sharing, this is also very important that you ensure that you're in side-by-side mode. I'm going to be forcing this presentation in gallery, so it should look okay, but if you're not already, you can go when I start screen sharing, which, you know what? I'm going to start screen sharing now so that everybody can do it if they need to. Okay, there we go. So now that I'm screen sharing, make sure that you're in side-by-side mode. And if you aren't doing this already, you can go up to the top of your screen where it says Jenny Sitchell is sharing her screen. And in the drop down there, be sure that you're in side-by-side mode. If you're using 2 monitors, you can check Optimize for dual monitors. And what this will allow you to do is adjust the video and PowerPoint to the size that you prefer. If you have any troubles or questions, please just let us know in the chat. In addition to our panel today, we will have plenty of time for audience questions, and you'll be able to answer or ask questions by going through the Q&A feature in the Zoom panel by there we go, the Zoom Q&A tab by emailing Jenny, Jenny, at ncil.org. Or if you are calling over the phone, you can press *9 on your keypad to raise your hand and we will pick on you. We will have a couple question and answer breaks. And then also nearing the end of the webinar, we'll do a Q&A portion. I did want to mention that we do have an evaluation that will be posted in the chat box also towards the end of the webinar, and then it will pop up on your screen when the webinar closes. We would be very grateful if you just take a few moments to complete the evaluation at the end of this. And I just want to make sure, can people just put into the chat box if you are able to see the closed captions? Just put yes or no. I just want to be sure about that. Okay. Beautiful. Thank you guys for your feedback there. And so if you are unable to see the captions, just to let you know again, you can go to the more and you will see a show subtitle setting. Make sure that you hit show subtitle in order to bring the subtitles up. And once we kind of get started, I'll also throw a link into the chat box that will provide you with more information, or will bring you to the AI media site, and then you can kind of zoom in, adjust the captions and what they look like. So that's a different website, but I'll throw that into the chat box as soon as we get started with this. So it's about that time to begin today's presentations. I first off want to introduce our presenters. We have Annetta Johnson, who is the Executive Director of Northwest Virginia Center for Independent Living. We have Kyle Kleist, who is the Executive Director at the Center for Independent Living for Western Wisconsin. And we have Paula McElwee, who is the Director of Technical Assistance for the ILNet National Training and Technical Assistance Center for Independent Living at ILRU. I want to thank you, and I want to thank everybody on this call for taking time for today's event. Make sure you fill out the evaluation at the end. So with that, we are going to get started. Oh, just kidding. Or Paula, you want to go over this a little bit?
Sure, I can do that.
Awesome.
Hi, everybody. I'm Paula. I'm a silver-haired, ruddy-complected Scottish heritage and other British Isles person. And I'm wearing a striped shirt, but I guess you can't see that very well. What we're going to talk about today, I think, is really important. And it is about how you assess your own program performance. Because you know that other people are going to assess it in different ways. And we'll talk a little about that as we weave through this topic. But you will probably have a state review if you receive Part B money or state funds for your independent living program. You will also, that sometimes has a separate review for the financial piece. You have your own internal audit that you hire independent auditors to do. Probably, you're not always required to, depending on your size, but probably you do that. And the question is, are you looking for yourself at the regulations, what they require, and what you do to meet them? We believe that the importance of assessing your own performance is directly connected to the independent living philosophy, and we want to emphasize that with you. How you assess your level of regulatory compliance and quality performance yourselves by using some kind of organizational self-assessment tool. We're going to talk about a couple of them. That's going to be one of the things you'll learn. And then also how to utilize those tools now before you have a review, the next review, in order for you to have the information you need about what you need to do to improve your performance. So all of those are going to be things that we'll discuss as we go along. Next slide, please, Jenny. We're going to talk about self-monitoring, and we have just a few thoughts about that. As I said, most of you have external monitoring. Monitoring isn't that new. Federal monitoring has been less frequent, but Part C centers know that they may get a federal review at any time. So the folks at ACL probably are almost always thinking about where they go for their next federal monitoring. So it could be anyone. And so you might ask the question, well, then why should we add to our workload by monitoring ourselves? Well, our question is it really added work, or does it focus the work you do so that you're always prepared for someone to come along and take a look at your services? Next slide, please, Jenny. Thank you. So because we're consumer controlled, we need to remember that the best way to apply regulations and policies for our community is for our community to do it itself. But we have to understand them. You know, we have to know, what do the regulations say? What are the policies around what we are required to do? And then be proactive in understanding those regs. So we don't just look at a piece of paper that says these are the regulations you have to follow, or just look at a sample reviewed instrument and say, oh, yeah, I think we meet all those. But to actually drill in a little bit, understand what the requirements are, and make sure that we are applying those regulations to allow us to present our consumer perspective about them to anybody who reviews us, so that we can say to them, this is how we do this, and this is why. You know, one of the things that is unequally understood across the country is that there is a lot of autonomy for the centers in how they apply regulations. There isn't just one way to do things. And so when you look at a monitoring instrument, it isn't as rigid as you might think. There are lots of ways for many of those regulations to be applied. For example, how you all do peer support. So how do you provide peer services? How do you monitor them? Are your staff considered peers, and is the work that they do then considered peer support? Do you only do it in group settings? Do you do it one-on-one? Do you use volunteers? All of these are real options for meeting that one core service, but that one core service is not defined. So you get to pick how you apply the regulations to provide that one core service. What do you do? And it may be very different from your neighbor down the street or in the next state. And that's true of a number of things within the regulations. There's flexibility. And we are consumer controlled, and our centers should be choosing to do the thing that you feel is most important for you to do for your center. I hope that made sense. So what you're looking at is a way to be proactive, understand the regs, but then also decide what you want to do to perform well in that specific area. Next slide, please. So when we look at this whole issue of monitoring, we want to talk to a couple of centers that are doing it. So I'm going to ask Annetta first and then Kyle second to tell us how your center conducts reviews to assess your compliance to regulations. So Annetta, tell us how you do that.
Management team will look at everything that we have available with policies and procedures and use the comp tool to guide us into what we need to be looking for, and then take it step by step so that we can go through. We include the board of directors in doing the research and making sure that we are meeting everything that we need to have. We have found some things that we need to continue to work on and bring up to be in total compliance. We are, but you know, there's always little things that you can change. It provided a lot of structure and the organizational framework that a lot of our individuals, you know, the information they weren't aware of before. So we have used it to definitely help us get on the right track.
Let's talk a little bit more about what the comp tool is. I'm going to put in the chat a link to that. But tell us a little more, Annetta, about where you found this and what it is.
My program director actually found it online and had been using it to kind of review things for a few years. before I came along. So it is put out by federal regulations so that it can help you make sure that you have all of the requirements. It points out that you need to have your 501c certificate, your bylaws, your IRS form 990, things like that. And then organizational documents, fiscal documents that you need to have, and program documents, so that you have this list of items, if you were reviewed, that can help you. If you have this stuff available and you know exactly where it is, then you are able to provide it a lot easier to the reviewers, and make the whole process simpler.
Right. So the COMP process, it stands for Compliance and Outcome Monitoring Protocol. That's what the COMP stands for. And that is a process that was put together by ACL. Now, will they ever change their process? I don't know if they're ever planning to, but if they do, our suggestion is you go with that flow. So as Annetta's organization has been doing, we suggest that it might be really useful for you to use this tool. It has the actual checklist that the people monitoring use. It has some documents that it lists for you, as Annetta was saying, so that you know some of the documents that you should always have available for a review. And it puts all that together in a format that is what the reviewers should be looking at when they come to see you in person. So if your federal reviewers come out, this is their document. Now, your state reviewers might not have this document. We suggest that they use it. Several states have asked me specifically, how do you think we ought to do monitoring? And some of them, I noticed, are still using the old RSA review document, which is from pre-2014. Not very current. I don't think very useful. I think it is very much more effective to be looking at this document because this is current. Are some of the questions the same? Sure, because some of the regulations are the same. But it actually covers the regulations, goes through the process, and makes sure that you take a look at that. So you're looking at the same things that the reviewer will look at. Now, my suggestion is that when you look at the checklists, that you don't just check yes or no, but that you write how you do it or what it is that you do or the policy number that applies. Make that checklist a place where you keep notes about your own conformance. And I think that's very useful. Carol, you asked about the controlled self-assessment, and off the top of my head, I don't know what that is. So if you'd write another note and tell me more, that would be useful. I did just put the link to this assessment in the chat. It's at acl.gov/programs/IL-comp. So you'll find it there. It's the last comment in the chat. So that's one of the ways that you can certainly look at your own self-assessment. We find it might be useful to use the same tool that the reviewers use. And like I said, not all your states use it. Some of the centers are getting together and taking a look at the whole state and asking the question, could we do all of this at the state level and make sure that we all are doing it, and that we ask our state, our DSE, to also use the same instrument so that we're all on the same page. I have a couple of questions showing up in the chat to the panelists and not to the whole group, but let me kind of throw them out really quickly. The O in COMP stands for outcome. So it's Compliance and Outcome Monitoring Protocol. And the instrument that Carol was referencing, it must be an instrument her state is using. It's not an instrument I'm familiar with unless somebody else is. So if it's a statement, if it's the instrument that the DARS uses, your Department of Rehabilitation Services is using, you know, it's up to you whether you want to advocate for a switch to this instrument, but I think it's useful. I think it's really, really helpful for you to take a look at that. So, so anyway, there are some thoughts on that. Kyle, we want to know about how you do compliance in Wisconsin because it's a very different model. So let's talk a little about what you do there.
Oh, thank you, Paula. Yeah, Kyle Kleist, pronouns are he, him. White male with glasses, graying hair and goatee. Yeah, Paula, you brought up some really great points about using the compliance tool. I like to think prior to assessment. So here in Wisconsin, we have what's called the CILs, or Quality Indicators in Independent Living Services, as a review tool that was developed by the centers as a way of making sure that all centers are not only complying, but shall we say, having best practice when it comes to independent living services across the spectrum. So the CILs tool, really like the comp tool, provides a great format for all of the documents that you're going to need and go through as part of the review. So I found it really helpful as a process as I'm collecting all the documents and going through everything and even the checklist, and it makes me dig deeper and to see how I'm actually doing when it comes to those services. But it really provides a great format to get everything together as far as all the documents. But you really brought up a great point about digging deeper as well, because one of the things about the CILs review, it really not only looks at just the checklist, but kind of digs deeper into how are you providing the services, making sure that they really meet the IL philosophy, that they're really consumer controlled, things like that. And it'll also, I found, it will make you aware of any shortcomings you might have prior to having the review done. So and you are probably going to be aware as an executive director, even going into a review, some of the things you might not be doing so well. But really getting prepared for it is a way that discover, you know, hey, these are some of the things that I'm going to find out as a process of the review. So I'll stop there for now.
Okay, don't stop quite yet. You know, this was a very different process, right? So what you just heard about was that the state centers had come up with their own process. Now it doesn't match everything else that's being done, but they do something really recent, really interesting, and that is it's a peer review process, not a self-review process. You might use the instrument for your self-review first, but it's a peer review process. What's it like, Kyle, to submit yourself to your peers for that kind of a review?
Oh, Paula, it's, you know, one of the things that I find really to be one of the best things about the CILs review is that it's done by your peers. So it's not, you're not looking at it, these are your compliance officers in any way coming in, but these are your peers. These are the people that you work with, you network with on a regular basis that are coming in. So I've been part of a review on several ends. I have been part of a review when I was on the board. I've been part of a federal RSA review toward the end when I first was assistant director. I've been co-facilitator of doing a review for another center. And also then recently having a review done. So I personally, from the process, knowing that it was my peers that were coming in, that were doing it, I felt it was almost a safer environment for me and the feedback that I would receive than it would be from the compliance officer, so to speak.
Yeah, I like to hear that because it seems to me like that has multiple advantages within a state. If you are willing to work together to do your internal self-review process and use peers to help with that monitoring process, I think that you will become a state that's much more open with one another about what are the areas of weakness, where are some areas that you could work together to build out your program and to make it more effective and more interesting. I think it just has a lot of advantages to have a peer process of that sort. I like to, I like the idea of having your peers be side by side with you. Now, not everybody's comfortable with that. And there are all kinds of reasons why, depending on how competitive your state is, whether how much trust there is between centers. But I think a goal for doing this kind of thing has some advantages to building those relationships between one another. Annetta, if I could ask you, how is this review different from your audit, from your independent audit?
The only independent audit we get is with our financial auditors that come in once a year. And I mean, they make sure that we are in compliance with financial type stuff. But as far as whether we have this other stuff, there is nobody monitoring that at this point. We don't get a state audit per se that looks at this type of stuff on a regular basis.
But that's kind of what I mean. Your financial audit is a group of auditors who ask you for a bunch of papers, right?
Yes.
Whether they do that in your office or in their office, and how much of that is electronic, all of that continues to shift to more and more of an electronic process. I think COVID drove it a little faster, maybe.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a very narrow look, isn't it, at what you do, where
Yes.
your comp system hits almost every area, right? It hits management, it's finance, and it's personnel.
It's a lot more detailed to me. Prior to this, I've always been on the financial side of it. I worked with the auditors on the financial part every year. That was my main job, was the financial side. So this is a lot more. I'm learning a lot. This is, as you know, short term for me so far. So all of these things that I'm seeing we're required to have, whether we have them or not, it's a lot of information, and it's very much more far-reaching than just the financial audit.
So it really is helping you do a deeper dive, as we mentioned kind of early, coming in, a deeper dive than you usually get to see of your own program. Because, who has time to go around and double check some of the stuff that we probably ought to double check, unless we make time, and this is a process that helps us make time.
Yes.
Yeah.
It definitely does help. I'm learning a lot from it. Like I said, there's a lot more information involved than I would have ever dreamed. But it gives a lot of guidelines and different suggestions, and are just very, very helpful.
Yeah. Kyle, if you wouldn't mind, it'd be great if you would answer that question you're answering in the chat from Daryl Christensen. If you would answer that here.
Sure. He was asking about, the CILs review. It does go into making sure that you're providing the core services as required and goes over, I would say it covers what your federal requirements are, but it also looks at what I consider to be best practices in independent living. So, and one of the great things in Wisconsin is a lot of the, not just IL services that we offer, are we making sure that we're kind of doing so in a best practice way, but also the fee for service work that we do as well, kind of as a network of centers.
Yeah, that's also another thing that really is an advantage of having a peer reviewer as part of your internal review or your review process too, is to share best practices. Because sometimes somebody else has got that best practice nailed and can really share that well, which is advantageous. If and when you all look at the comp system, oh, go ahead, Kyle.
No, Paula, I was just gonna get on talk about the other part that I added to is, other services that you offer, making sure that they stay with that IL philosophy of consumer control. So we operate a couple other programs, but we want to make sure that those programs really stay within the IL philosophy too. I think that's important, and the review looks at those as well.
Yeah, it does. And it really looks at, is the philosophy present, is the IL philosophy present throughout your program? If you look at the form, that you'll find there's instructions, and then you'll find there's a checklist. And I mentioned before, don't just check off yes or no on the checklist, but make comments. There's a comment section on that form. And so what that comment section does is give you an opportunity to actually say how you do it. So it asks, did you provide independent living skill training during the last year or the period of time that they're reviewing? And you could just say yes, or you could think to yourself, okay, what is the best way I have to show them how great our independent living skills training is? Best practices, right? So you've got that concept, and you want to make sure that whatever you do, you are doing the best within the philosophy. And so the questions themselves, and Daryl, this goes to your question about how do you measure the IL philosophy for review. You have to continually, I mean, they have measurements in here about consumer control, but you have to continually think, oh, let me think about how do I do this and do it well. And the questions and answers throughout that checklist, if you actually take the time to answer them thoroughly, will lead you in the right direction. I want to mention something that can happen during such a review. It's never good news exactly, but it's preferable to the alternative. And one of the things that can happen during a thorough review on your part is that you may find that there's something going on that shouldn't be. Now, how serious that is can vary a lot from one place to the next. So in one case, it might be a serious embezzlement, and the next case, it might just be that someone doesn't understand your record keeping system and isn't keeping good records of services, and everything in between. But when you do your own thorough review, you will find things that need to be improved, and you want to do them now, regardless of whether you're going to have a federal review in the next few years or not, because you want to do the best services you can do, right? So as you do a review, you may yourselves find something that needs correction. And don't be afraid of that. And in fact, embrace it, because isn't it better that you find it than if it's the state state DR or the DSE or the federal reviewers? You need to know yourselves whether things are being handled according to your policies and procedures. And one of the things that they'll do is say, do you have a policy? And then they'll ask, do you follow it? And so you can't just check the yes box and say, yes, we have a policy. You have to also think in terms of, are we following all the elements of this policy? Or sometimes you may be thinking, is this policy thorough enough? So I was talking to somebody earlier about conflict of interest. And we were discussing the conflict of interest policy, and we were thinking out loud about a situation, personnel situation where there's a conflict, and whether or not the policy adequately covered that situation. You should be doing that kind of review every time you use a policy. Is this policy the very best it can be to address this situation, whatever the situation is? And that's what you're seeking as you go through this checklist. That's what you're really wanting to look for as you go through. There are lots of sections in the checklist. I don't know how many pages it is total, but only eight pages total. But if you write your notes in the comments and then turn over the paper and write more on the back, or use an electronic version and just keep letting the comments expand, I think you may find that you really will know more about your own organization than you did before you started, because they may be asking questions you just haven't thought of before. The questions are all directly related to compliance, so they're important, but they're also useful. They help you with your organizational structure. Let's look at that next slide, Jenny. So here's the question that I've kind of been circling around. How does this process help your center to perform better? Annetta, would you like to lead off on that?
The process is helping us get a better understanding of what we need to be doing, where we need to be at, and doing research for how others are doing the processes is also helping us to modify ours to where we need to be. We've had to show a little progressiveness as far as coming up to the current time for the things that we do at the center. It's a lot of
I hate to interrupt you, but your sound isn't very good. Could you come a little closer to your microphone? We're having trouble hearing you.
Okay. I think in the process that we're coming up a little better with the times, that going into the details of the things that we're supposed to have, how we do them, and then additionally, how other people are doing them are helping us to improve the process of how we're dealing with our consumers.
And I don't know if either of you have done this, but one of the things that I've seen that I really like is that after you've finished your review, whether you do an annual review or every 2 or 3 years, that you feed the review information back individually to some of the staff that it impacts, both compliments and things that need corrected, so that you can continue that process. Kyle, how does the process help your center perform better?
Paula, same thing as what Annette was getting at. It really, well, one, like she was saying, modifying or making sure, or creating processes, making sure you have those in place. Really finding out what you can be doing better. Where are your shortcomings? So, I mean, one of the things that came out of our review was we need to be doing a better job when it came to peer support. I mean, and I knew we weren't doing a very good job, but the review process really kind of made that stand out. And one of the things I know you and I were talking about prior to this was using it for strategic planning. So we had done the review prior to our 3-year strategic plan. So what came out of the review was so helpful, so we could include those things in our 3-year strategic plan to make sure that as a center, we were going to address them. I mean, really developing goals and strategies around them. So things like peer support, things that came out like outreach to underserved populations. So that went into our strategic plan. Training, more additional training for staff around like diversity, equity, inclusion. That wound up in our strategic plan. So that was one of the really things that I found most helpful, was coming out of the review and going into our strategic planning. It really helped to guide us as a center, and as our board found it very helpful as well. So whether you're going to be going through any kind of compliance review or not, if you're coming up on your 3-year strategic plan, you know, just going over the comp tool is a great way to help to really look at what are some of the things you need to be addressing over the next 3 years.
Boy, I really like the idea of the comp tool leading directly into planning. I think that anytime you assess yourself, you should find ways individually or as an organization as a whole that you can continue to progress to meet the needs that you've uncovered through your review process. Annetta, there's a question for you in the chat. I think you must have used the word progressiveness and said you've had very little progressiveness, and they were wondering what you meant by that.
Well, in West Virginia, until the last year or two, there has been executive directors that were the same executive directors since the 90s or 80s, whenever the individual centers started, that continue to do the things the same way as they did when they started. Times are a little different now. The availability of different types of communication and electronics that are out there, it's definitely changing the way that we can do things. And so in the 6 or 7 months since I have been the ED, we have been able to bring us a little more up to date and progress in the ways that we can perform our services with our consumers and get our messages out there. Does that answer the question?
I think it does. Thank you very much. You know, as we look at this whole big picture of what centers, what the landscape looks like for centers, I don't know if we should call it post-COVID. I haven't decided, but post most of the COVID response. We did learn some things through that process. And I think one of the things that we learned is both the strengths and weaknesses of electronic information. And I just want to suggest that as you look at a performance review process, that you do 2 things. That you look first at the policy or the written documentation, and then you say to your staff, okay, now show me how you do this. Because you're never going to really have a complete picture, right, of the things that are or are not happening if you don't have that direct response from your staff. Let's look at that next slide, Jenny. Here's a fun one. So you're going to have a review process. So you're asking questions and looking around, and maybe you have some peer reviewers as a part of your process. Okay. Do you find that that review process then becomes a place for your staff to vet personal gripes? And how do you handle that? I'm going to direct this one to Kyle first.
Thank you, Paula. Yes. So as I previously said, I have been part of a review team, so co-facilitator, and then as recently gone through a review. So let me just say, not going into any details or anything, but this you might see as an opportunity that staff may have grievances or issues that have nothing to do with how you're performing as a center, but they may use this as a venue to air some of those grievances. How I handle that, I just look at it as what it is. I'll deal with it after the review process or have their supervisor deal with it, whatever the case may be. But just getting back to and reminding the reviewers as well that, you know, this is all about how we're operating as a center, and, you know, but on, you know, on the same note, the reviewers may come across a serious issue that you might not be aware of. So if something like that came out, I mean, one of the great things is, you know, that with the CILs review, that it's your peers that you're working with and dealing with. So if a serious issue did come out, rather than anybody of your compliance officers, shall we say. But I've seen from both sides that there may be opportunities that staff might use this as just a way of airing some of their grievances.
Yeah, I think sometimes they feel like I have a person here who's going to have to listen to me because they're in the process of doing this review. Annetta, have you had an experience of that sort at all or not?
Reviews yet. That no matter what you're doing wants to get their personal gripes in there. I usually just try to divert the conversation by, you know, this isn't really the time and place for that. Let's set up a time that we can talk. But as far as a review, I've not had that come up yet now.
Okay. One of the things I sometimes suggest when it's in the middle of a review is let's go look at your policy on what you're supposed to do about this. You know, and so we look at the policy and procedure and it says, whatever it says, that it must be in writing to the supervisor, or it goes directly to the executive director, or there's a grievance committee of the board. There are lots of different setups within your centers. So you want to follow your own policy, looking to see what that policy says first, so that you know exactly what's going on, right? And following that policy, helping the staff person to follow that policy is important. Sometimes in this process, you realize, oh, the staff person doesn't really know where to find the policies. They weren't told, they didn't get a copy of the personnel handbook. They came on board during a transition and didn't get the update. Whatever the weird situation is, sometimes that person just does not know, or says that they do not know, in which case you still want to go back, right, to the policies and say, well, here's the policy and let's follow the policy to resolve this gripe. Let's follow it through. So, so you can kind of see how that process works at the same time. Maybe not completely, because the policy sometimes gives you 30, 60 days or whatever to resolve it. And of course, your comp review is usually going to be 2 or 3 days. So, so maybe not followed through entirely. Okay, next slide. I think we might have covered this one, Kyle, because I jump ahead sometimes, but anything else to say on your peer review process and how you accept and use peer feedback?
Well, you know, Paula, it really goes to one of the great things about the CILs review is it is confidential. So when you get that final report back from the review team, which, remember, those are your peers, it generally consists of 3 people that would be within administration within an IL center, but it also includes experienced IL staff as well. So that is yours to do with as you will. Since the review is paid for through the State Independent Living Council, one of the requirements is that you just highlight a couple of the areas that you plan to work on. But generally, the tools, you know, what came out of it is yours to do with. You could say, I don't agree with any of this crap and throw it away. Or you could take it to heart and say, wow, I really need to look at some of this stuff and dig into it and find out how I can do better. But like I said, one of the things that I've always found is that when I know it's coming from my peers, I find it easier to accept because these are people that I know for the most part have been in IL and are there providing direct services too. So I tend to take the more optimistic side when it comes to accepting the review and the feedback from it.
Well, and I like that. Honestly, I think it's so healthy when a state can do that. When they can do a peer review because they have a good enough relationship between the network members in that state that they can actually review and follow up and follow through and support each other in improving services statewide. Let's look at that next slide. Whoops. This slide is to remind you about that evaluation, but we're going to go to questions and answers now. So we're in a slide or two. So the comp review developed by the feds addresses the core services, and there are more than just core services available. It does address some of those programs as far as the philosophy is captured in some of the questions. But let's talk a little bit more about exactly how it drills down and helps you with those services who are not core. And Kyle, let's start with you because I know you mentioned this a little earlier.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Well, one thing that I'll point to is we have a personal assistance services, or as we call it, a PAS program, which I know a number of independent living centers across the country are getting into the personal care business because we're wanting to be there to provide those home and community-based services. So get people out of institutions. But as those programs go larger, are they staying with the true IL philosophy? Are they consumer directed? Or have they become more of a service provision than part of your IL center? Is your agency an IL center at the heart of it, regardless of what other programs you operate? So, I mean, we operate a volunteer driver program that covers half the state of Wisconsin. And when we do that, I mean, are we staying true to independent living when it comes to the services we're providing? When it comes to the riders and what their goals, their wishes are? And even with the drivers, when we do our training for our drivers, is it talking about independent living? And so really, that's what we want to stay true to is, you know, as other programs grow and, you know, other IL centers get into the, shall we say, the fee for service game, we always want to make sure that it's really, that it's driven by that IL philosophy of consumer control. I mean, that's my own personal belief as well, but I believe it should speak true for all of the other programs that we operate from IL centers outside of those 5 core services.
Annetta, did you have anything to add to that?
I know that, like, we are starting a veterans program, mainly because it was brought to us by ACL, but it does definitely fit in the IL philosophy. And how the comp tool is going to help or hurt with that, I'm not sure yet because we haven't gotten into it that far. But I know because of the comp review tool, I am looking at things a little closely with this new program to make sure that it does keep in line with where it needs to be.
And that's a really good point. As you look at any new programs that you're putting into place, there are going to be some of the things that have to do with goal setting and record keeping and other things that apply to whatever services that you provide. In fact, did you all know that centers are required to provide the core services +2? Have you ever heard that? The core services +2? I'd almost forgotten about it because it'd been so long since I heard about it. And then I read through the comp tool, and in section 9, just in case you want to check me out and see if I know what I'm talking about. In section 9, it says during the reporting year, did the CIL provide a combination of any 2 or more of the other IL services defined in section 718B of the Act? And there's a list of other services that can be independent living. And at one time, it was real clear to us that we must provide 2 more besides the core services. And while that has not been talked about a lot lately, that is still in the comp tool. So is evidently something that ACL will be looking for. It was worth it to come just to hear that, right? Let's go ahead and look at the next slide. Questions. I hope that you do have some questions about how to do this, about anything that we haven't made clear as we've gone along here. Here's one from Tiffany. Don't you feel like some of the funds coming through to centers via ACL and federal entities are not challenging us on the philosophy? Kyle and Annetta, why don't you guys both unmute and let's all answer these questions as they come up.
Okay.
All right, so do you feel that the funds are not, or the funders are not challenging us on the philosophy?
You know, I think I would agree with that, Paula. There may be times that the funders aren't challenging us. That's where we have to challenge ourselves, or, you know, even make sure that our board is challenging us, you know, or your staff for that matter. Staff that are involved, make sure that, you know, that it's being driven by the independent living philosophy, because there's so much that goes on that so many centers are involved in providing those home and community-based services. So we want to make sure that they really are driven by that philosophy.
Yeah, this compliance tool has some philosophy elements that I'm not sure centers think about very much. So if you look at section 5 of the comp tool, it's talking about from the purposes of the Rehab Act, it's talking about the equal access section from the purposes. And it specifically asked, did the CIL promote equal access for individuals with significant disabilities within their communities and to all service programs and so forth and so on. And there's, you know, 3 or 4 questions about equal access specifically. It asks about, are you reaching out to a range of significant disabilities? So it's asking that cross disability question. Philosophy has to do with a lot more sometimes than just consumer control, which is essential, absolutely. And I'm not saying it isn't, but wow, what a big deal it is to think about equal access. Where on earth do we have equal access really? Right? And to ask, what are we doing to address equal access, and to take 4 questions, you know, ask 4 questions in this compliance tool of only 8 pages is a pretty big challenge to our philosophy. So Tiffany, I think you're right. Sometimes it doesn't come through. Sometimes the focus seems to be just on the consumer information file or the core services and not really on the philosophy pieces. But as centers, we need to really make sure that we do focus on those philosophy pieces. And they're important things that we must also do. Now, I know there are some centers out there that are getting paid based on time provided for each core service. And one of the challenges that I gave back, although they, you know, this particular state said, no, we give lots of money, so we don't need to worry about that. But my challenge back is, as soon as you try to pay for so many hours of core services, you're missing this whole point, right? It's a very important thing to look at equal access, and we can't miss that. So we need to keep a look at that.
Yeah. Paula, I just wanted
Yeah.
to say that one of the great things about the quiz review that I found helpful was, I mean, they interviewed both my transportation director, my finance director, my PAS program director, and those staff as well. So, you know, it wasn't just the IL staff that were part of the review. It was the entire agency and all the staff and all the programs we operate that were part of that whole review process.
Yeah, so Angela's asking about, you know, financial policies. They're extensive, very helpful in thinking it through, but how do we get the board to review them? And I think the response is you interview the board about them, right? That's part of this comp process. So you can ask the board, what do they know about their financial policies and procedures? They're in charge of that. They have the responsibility at the end of the day for the finances of the organization. So I think taking the bylaws back to them and asking them questions as part of the interview process, doing the same with both the financial policies and their policies and procedures. Sometimes they have policies and procedures, and then the bylaws themselves, I think would be a really effective way to do that. What do you guys think?
I agree 100%.
Okay. Other questions, y'all? You have lots of time.
Paula, you know, one last thought that came up that you and I had discussed that nobody, I'm surprised, has brought up today is virtual versus in person. We are still in the time of COVID and conducting a review virtually versus in person. You were part of the review team when I was on that. So being there in person, you had so much readily access to staff. If you needed to follow up on policies, get questions answered, things like that, it was really easy to do. Now, when it was conducted at my center the year before was the time of COVID, it was done virtually. And even those people that conducted the review pointed that there were a number of shortcomings since it was conducted virtually. And I will agree with that hands down. You weren't able to really get the full feel of the center, so to speak. Really talk with the staff, be there in person, get real good and quick follow-up if you had questions and things like that. So I would highly encourage people, if you can avoid doing it virtually, do so. In person is so much better, and you'll really get much better information doing it that way.
Yeah, and when you're doing your self-review, you know, as you're doing each of these questions, the most effective way to do it is to go to the person responsible and to say to the person responsible, show me how you do this. And they can, you know, show you where they keep notes, or show you, you know, their phone log, or show you whatever it is that will demonstrate to you what it is they do. And you can't really do that effectively. You can say, tell me about, but it's not the same as seeing or hearing directly from them as they're actually showing you a process. Any other questions or comments? Daryl asked, to this point, what are ACL's plans moving forward with conducting reviews? Have they said how many virtual or in person, and what do you know? What they have said is that the PPR process, the program performance report that you submit in December each year, that process itself is part one of the review. And that they will look at that, and they will give you feedback, and they will ask questions, and they'll make sure that you have, you know, met the compliance required for your center based on your PPR. So that's part one. And they intend to do that for all centers. And they only had, I think they said they only had one center that didn't provide the PPR. So That's an interesting one to look at. As you consider that as the first process, then the question is, what would other processes be? And they do some phone follow-up. If they get a complaint, I understand they do sometimes follow up with that center. I do understand that they are also preparing to do their first in-person reviews sometime in the, coming, the rest of this calendar year or next year. I don't know exactly when. They were contacting us about a piece of the process, but they didn't tell us how many or where or anything like that. But I could tell that there was activity around it. So I think they are moving towards doing those in-person reviews at some point in the future. And I think we'll look forward to seeing that. Good question, though. And we would all love to know when and where and how many reviews.
Well, I think somebody had their hand up.
I saw that and I don't know what to do with that, but Jenny's working on it.
Okay.
Yeah, because a hand up doesn't show in this format of a webinar. So she's
I can just
replying.
check
Yeah.
in. If you do have your hand raised for accessibility, that is great. If you are able to type your answer into the Q&A section, that would be even better, so that we can reserve hand raising for individuals that are phoning in. So if you can just let us know either way in the Q&A section, I can either unmute you or we can answer your question after you type it in.
Okay. And do you know Kobe's question or?
I do not know Kobe's
Okay.
question.
Kobe, we don't have any way to mic you that I'm
Oh no,
aware
I can allow him to talk or allow them to talk. So
of. Okay.
why don't we do that?
Okay.
So Kobe, I'm going to allow you to talk.
Kobe, what's your question?
Go ahead, Kobe. You just have to take yourself on and off of mute.
There
Can
you
you
are.
hear?
Yep.
Oh, great. Oh, this is Kobe Livingstone. I'm the vice chair in Albuquerque for the statewide Independent Living Council. And I've got lots and lots of questions, but I'm legally blind and I use a screen reader. So I can't listen to you guys, listen to the people, and listen to my screen reader and type a question. So I really wanted to just talk and I couldn't do that in the webinar thing. So this is great. So when you talk about a state, when you talk about a strategic plan, are you talking about the state plan that comes every 3 years?
No, we're talking about the center's plan. So each center, this is not the spill that the SILC does.
Bill, thank you.
Right, but each center also must have some kind of a work plan. They're required to have a 3-year work plan. They comment on it in their PPR each year. And so we were talking about as you're preparing for that process. So it's actually for the centers specifically.
So when each of the panelists talks about the state review, is that the SILC
No,
reviews the CILs? All right.
no, the SILC does not review the CILs. The designated state entity does. So it's that designated state entity.
Okay.
That's the state of New Mexico's Department.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Laura, or Paula, I just wanted to answer to Kobe's point. One of the things is that we do provide feedback on the CILs to our State Independent Living Council, since the funding for that review does flow through them. So, and as well as the DSE as well.
Thank you. And how many states on average have the state as their DSE?
Well, every state has a DSE. It is not always
Correct.
rehabilitation. But I only know of 3 states, I think, where it's not the Department of Rehabilitation.
Okay,
That's
that's
because
not-
of our history. That's where we came from, you know, and so to break free from that isn't always something that makes sense, but
yeah, it's not an easy thing, and it's something we're talking about in New Mexico. But
Kobe, we need to get you on the silk calls.
absolutely, thank you.
Yeah,
I would love
I
that.
I think I sent that
Oh.
information, but
Oh, you probably did, but do it again, please.
yeah, but if you well, I'll work on it, and if I don't find it, I'll call you and get your email.
Okay,
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 we'll email you on that.
yeah. So I'm glad to have this, and in our State Independent Living Council, we'll be going through a what's going on in New Mexico. Why can't we keep an executive coordinator,
Yeah,
director?
Kobe, why don't you and I talk about that further? Because I want to be on that call.
Okay, but,
All right.
you know,
I need to answer a couple of other questions, so
but
this
my
really is-
point is that it's so important not to do the blame game, not to do this, here's my time to air my griefs. I just thought that was a great point and really needs to be emphasized and handled with care. Thank you, Paula, and the rest of
Thank
you.
you, Kobe. We'll talk to you a little bit later.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Lois, you asked what the options are for the +2 services. It's a long list, and it includes things that don't make any sense to me, like, you know, like therapy, psychological therapy, and it has an other at the end. So it includes just about everything you can imagine, but you can look at that reference that we had on the slide, or I can send you a reference with the list. Would you take a second, Kyle, and explain how your quills process came about?
Oh, boy, I'm not as well versed on the history, but it came about as a result of really wanting to look at best practice within independent living. I believe it was the first review was done back in the 90s. Boy, I would need Maureen Ryan.
Okay, I'm old enough. I can give some of this.
Okay.
So the centers just decided to be proactive about it. They looked around and said, nobody's really reviewing us about the things we think are important. Let's put this together and let's review each other. And it was done mostly by the State Association of Centers. That's who took the lead. It was Maureen Ryan, who was the director there at the time, and took the lead on that. And it really was, and it filled a very important gap, I think, in review processes, and was very useful in that way. The question about whether you would do it quite the same way, though, now, I think that there's already discussion, right, about the quills process being so different from the comp process, and that you wouldn't really necessarily set one aside for the other because they're complementary. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate. Absolutely. We would still, I mean, even though we would be using the comp, we still feel that the quills review is a really helpful tool as well.
Right. And as far as the Part B versus Part C centers, the quills, the comp system really does address the same, Part B centers and Part C centers are really not that different in what they're required to provide. And they still have to meet the federal regulations. And so the actual process of reviewing them with the comp system is going to be the same, and it's going to be virtually no differences between the two when you look at the review process. So the things that are reviewed apply both to Part B and Part C. Part C is usually who's reviewed directly by ACL. Part B centers are reviewed by the DSE, these are the requirements they should meet, but your DSE may have another instrument that they're using. So be aware of that and find out what they're using. Talk them into using this. All right, other questions that we can answer for you?
Paula, I just want to direct you to one in the chat section
Okay.
from Curtis.
So I keep hearing that these reviews are awesome, but other than making sure we're compliant and that staff are documenting it correctly, I really don't see the connection of how this lets you know that your center can better improve services to your consumers. Well, there are some elements of it that we haven't talked about in detail that have to do specifically with the consumer satisfaction with your process. So you're looking at consumer satisfaction, you're looking at the quality of goal setting and whether or not goals are being met by your consumers. You're looking at several of those kinds of things. So, you know, we haven't emphasized that. We probably should have more. There are some very direct connections. But the other part of it is, as a center, isn't it cool to look at your whole setup at once? Really examine every piece over a week at the most, you know, a few days. Look at it, make notes, and at the end, you know, celebrate it. Bring everybody who wants to come in if you're doing that, if you're doing in-person stuff. If you're not doing in-person stuff, have an online party and celebrate. Here are the things that we felt we were really doing well. Here are the things we discovered that we want to improve. Let's all get on board. Congratulations to all of you for such a great job. Thank you for participating in this. You know, it's a way to encourage people for the things they're doing well. It's a way to solicit input from the consumers. Your consumer surveys can fit right into the process. And you can continually look at how can we improve. So hopefully that's something that works for everybody. Further questions or comments? Last thoughts from Annetta, or did you have a comment?
I'm just going to say that, you know, using the comp tool, there, you know, there's a compliance review document upload section. It just gives you a checklist. One of the things that I never thought of that is on the accessibility checklist part is the making sure that there's braille or raised markers on the microwave. Now, it is our staff kitchen. We don't have one necessarily for consumers, but that was something that I hadn't even thought of. So there are little things in here that are really helpful, even if you don't go full bore on to make everything they're suggesting, you know, the way that you do things. But there was definitely a lot in here that brought things to my attention or were helpful to me that I would definitely suggest people look into it.
Yeah, I did a review with a center with a person that I respect very much as the executive director, and walked in and there were scented candles burning. And of course, we want to keep our environments free of anything that's going to trigger negative reactions, allergies, and so forth with people who have sensitivity around that thing. And so, you know, I stopped and talked to each person at their desk about that, and that, you know, it's not a great idea. Then went back and talked to the executive director about it, and he was sitting there with the associate director, and they looked at each other and they said, you know, we have had this sewer smell in the back of the building, and we thought that would make a worse impression on the reviewers than the candles, and so we have all these candles burning. I said, no, you got to do what's right, and that's, you have a policy, don't you, about scented items in your workplace? Let's take a look at that. We have time for a couple more questions if you all have some.
You know, Paula, I wanted to include one last thought as well as one of the great things that we do here in Wisconsin with the CILs review is that we highlight the things that you're doing great as well. So it's not just compliance. Are you documenting? I mean, when you're really doing some great stuff, the review highlights that and says, you know, you guys really rock when it comes to doing X, Y, Z or whatever.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's not just looking at what your shortcomings are, it's looking at your strengths as well.
Yep. Good point. You really want to celebrate those. What about frequency of reviews? Are you guys both doing them manually, or do you do them less frequently than that?
Plan to do them annually. This is my first year, so we're just working on it, but I think it will probably be look at it directly once a year, but it is an ongoing process even throughout the year when you get new programs, when anything you have that comes up that's an issue in your center, that's something that you can go back to
Go back and
make
review.
it, see what the recommendations are.
Yeah.
So that's for me being new, that's where I'm at with it.
Okay. How about you, Kyle?
You know, it doesn't hurt it to review it annually, and I would say dig deep into it at least every 3 years when you're going to do your center strategic planning.
Yeah, I think digging deep is important. And so if that means every other year for you or every 3 years for you as you do your planning, I think that's certainly acceptable. You just need to make sure that it's meaningful review. Because if you don't do a meaningful review, your process is just cursory. If you dig deep into each of these things and really ask yourself, how do I prove this? How do I show this? Is this something we can, you know, demonstrate that we're doing? I think it really does make a big difference. And Jenny, I think we might be done.
Okay. Great. We'll go to the last slide and make sure that people do fill out our survey. I will put it one more time in to the chat. And then actually, I'm going to come on video here. Yeah, so if everybody could fill out the evaluation, thank you again for joining, and have a great afternoon. Thanks all.